Good evening, folks. We are going to get into Genesis chapter 4 tonight. A few major points I want to hit on tonight. Um, Getting into some fairly thick ideas when we get into Genesis 4. And I know that at least in addressing the denominational world, we're going to hit some points that I think are going to be contrary to um, anything that they teach. Hey, Stephen, thanks for joining us tonight. Um, but anyway, I'm going to get into the text, and then we'll hit those points as we hit them in the text. So Genesis chapter 4 and verse 1. And Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bare Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from Jehovah. And she again bare his brother Abel, and Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. Wow, lots of people jumping on. Nikki, Chad, glad to have y'all aboard. And so, again, I want to hit this point that you have man in Genesis 1 is told that he can eat of the herbs, they are given to him for meat. But here you have Abel being a keeper of sheep. Well, why would Abel keep sheep if they don't eat meat? Keep in mind that they did use them for clothing, that God had prepared for Adam and Eve animal skins for them to wear. Sheep had wool to shear. So there would be a number of reasons to keep animals that don't necessarily relate to the idea of keeping them for food. So anyway, the other point, just real briefly, is that Eve says, I have gotten a man from Jehovah. And so we still see here a really solid relationship where God is still talking directly to man. And he does this. He does this up through Noah and Abraham. And then by the time we get to Moses, you're going to start to see this really start to separate. There's this kind of distancing of God from man, where he starts to speak through a singular person to a large group, as opposed to talking like he does here with Cain and Abel. So in the process of time, verse 3, it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto Jehovah, and Abel he also brought of the firstlings of his flock, and of the fat thereof. And Jehovah had respect unto Abel and unto his offering, but unto Cain and to his offering he had not respect. And Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. So I've seen a number of different understandings of this. I've seen a number of people talk about, well, Cain brought plants, or he brought fruit, or whatever. He didn't bring an animal sacrifice. But Abel did, and that's why God was pleased. But you notice here, Moses makes a big deal out of Abel bringing the firstlings of his flock and the fat, or the best of his flock, whereas Cain just brings some stuff. He brought the fruit of the ground. There's no qualifiers there talking about how good it was, or how it was the first or the best, or anything like that. Also, when you read through Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and you start looking at all of the offerings that the Israelites were supposed to make, the wave offerings and the sheave offerings, there were grain offerings that were made, plant-based offerings that were made. And part of that was because the Israelite nation was supporting the Levitical priesthood, who did not have their own land in the promised land. They did not work in the sense of having land to till, or holding it for livestock or anything like that. So God accepts plant-based offerings in the Old Testament. They aren't necessarily related to the covering of sin in that sense, but he did accept them. So there's nothing wrong with Cain bringing a plant-based offering, since that's his labor. That's what he chose to do, was to work in the field, to raise crops. But he didn't bring the best, and I think that's where the distinction lies. I think that's the problem that God has with Cain's offering, is that it's not the best. So Verse 6, and Jehovah said unto Cain, Why are you wroth, and why is your countenance fallen? If you do well, should you not be accepted? And if you do not well, sin lies at the door. So God's actually warning Cain here. You didn't do well, and it's going to lead you to sin. So God's trying to gently correct him and say, look, just do better, bring better, and you'll be okay. But if not, your sin's going to lie at the door. So he finishes it up, verse 7, and unto you shall be his desire, and you shall rule over him. So looking at the ESV, if you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you have to rule over it. And I think that's a better way to look at it is, look, sin's there. That physical desire, the inordinate desire, and you have to be a master of it. Paul talks about this in Romans 7, where it's his flesh versus his spirit. Cool, Stephen. In Romans 7, Paul talks about this warfare that's going on. Now remember, Paul's already a Christian at the time that he writes this book or this letter to the church at Rome. And he says, there's these things that I don't want to do, but I do them because his flesh is trying to get him to do things. His physical self, he has these desires for too much food, or desires towards women. Remember, Paul wasn't married. You have all of these things that the flesh, these drives that we have, and if we don't control them, then they rule over us. We should rule over our own bodies, and that's what Paul talks about with the mind or the spirit. There's that spiritual side of us that's made in the image of God that should be ruling everything that we do. Yeah, exactly so, Stephen. Exactly. Great point. Just 4 books into the Bible, and God is telling us he just doesn't accept any and all worship. It's got to be specific. And I've got an article on my webpage, surprisingly, that talks about the nature of worship. What is worship? And it has to be intentional. It has to have the proper target, and it has to be authorized for it to be true worship. Otherwise, if you aren't intending to worship, you're not worshiping. If you aren't worshiping God, then you're worshiping an idol. So if your target's wrong, and if it's not authorized, then it's vain worship. So check that out. It's the swordmasterpublications.fandom.com. They changed it from Wikia. So, but anyway, so God's here telling, hey, rule over your desires, rule over your sin, and you'll be all right. So verse 8, and Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. And Jehovah said unto Cain, Where is Abel your brother? And so Cain's like, I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? And he said, What have you done? This is Jehovah talking. And he said, What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries unto me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the earth. So important here. Remember, Moses is writing. He's talking to these wandering ex-slaves. And now you are cursed from the earth. Did Cain get kicked off the planet? No. What is the earth? The earth in this case is actually the land, the region where everybody is still living. Remember Adam and Eve, and they had sons and daughters and all of this going on during this time period. Well, they stayed right around in the same area. And God's kicking him out. He's saying, you need to go off somewhere else. You're not allowed in this area, this region anymore to be around anybody else. So you are cursed from the ground. And then he's also saying that the one thing that Cain was really good at, he was the tiller of the ground. He says, the ground or the land which has opened her mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand, when you till that ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto you her strength. A fugitive and a vagabond you will be in the earth. And that's that idea of the geo, or the ge, if you look at the Greek, um, but it's the land. So, hey Brian, welcome aboard. We're talking in Genesis 4 here. Verse 13, and Cain said unto Jehovah, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me out this day from the face of the earth. Again, he's not driving him off the planet. He's just driving him out of the region. And from your face shall I be hid, and I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth. That's the larger earth, the planet. Then it shall come to pass that every one that finds me shall try to slay me. And Jehovah said unto him, therefore, whoever slays Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And Jehovah set a mark upon Cain, lest any finding him should kill him. Now, there's some major points to be addressed here. Number one, we've already seen Eve is the mother of all living. Who are all of these people that are going to try to kill Cain? Well, they're family members. These are brothers and sisters mostly, and they're also brothers and sisters to Abel, who Cain killed. So this isn't just random strangers. Oh, there goes that Cain guy. I heard he killed his brother. No, it's, hey, there's Cain who killed our brother. And so, yeah, there's going to be a lot of anger there. And so that's where Cain's coming from. It's like, my whole family's going to try to kill me because I killed Abel, the second son, the second oldest son here. And so these people are not a secondary set of human beings that did not come from Adam and Eve, because Eve is the mother of all living. There is nothing about this Lilith concept. There's nothing about an ancient world, and Adam and Eve just happen to be kind of this covenant idea where God is focused on them to tell them a story, that Moses is focused on them to tell them the origins of the Israelites, but there were other people in the world. That's not what Moses is saying at all. He says that Eve is the mother of all the living. And so we're talking about a family here, brothers and sisters, and potentially their children at this point. So anyway, Jehovah puts a mark on Cain and says that if anybody tries to kill Cain, then vengeance will be taken on them sevenfold. Remember, one of the things that they're supposed to be doing at this time is filling the earth, multiplying. And so verse 16, Cain goes out from the presence of Jehovah and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. So he's driven out of the land. He's driven out of the earth. And I like this phrase here, driven out from the presence of Jehovah. And what this indicates is that Jehovah is still walking among them. And again, I believe that this is the idea of the pre-incarnate Jesus. So he's no longer allowed to walk and talk with God. He's going to go to this land that Moses and the Israelites would recognize as Nod. That's not necessarily meaning that Cain called it that, but that Moses and the Israelites would understand what that is. And he says that, hey, that's a little bit east of Eden, so we're heading a little bit more out of the Mesopotamian area, heading out more towards I'm not saying into Asia, but in the direction of China, so like Saudi Arabia and all that. And Cain knew his wife, so he's already got a wife, and he knows his wife in the biblical sense. So she conceives and bears a son called Enoch. Well, who is Cain's wife? Where did Cain get his wife from? The only conclusion, if you just take scripture, is that Cain married his sister. And the reaction, the typical reaction is, ew, that's gross. Some people say, no, that can't be because incest is absolutely sinful. There's all kinds of reactions that come from this. Well, number one, we're talking pre-flood. We're talking pre-destruction of the canopy. We're talking pre-degradation of the genetic code in humans. These people are still living to be 1,000 years old. Their genes are practically perfect. And so the reasons that incest would be condemned later on don't exist yet. And so there isn't a problem with Cain marrying his sister and procreating with her. And this goes to the idea those who are alive are not necessarily living. I'm not entirely sure what you mean, but I've already answered the question, Brian, perhaps before you joined us. I said that Cain's wife is his sister, and Cain feared his family, that these are all come from Eve, because Eve is the mother of all the living, as it says in Genesis 2. But anyway, this goes to the idea of some of the nature of sin. Sin, there are some things that are just inherently sinful. They're sinful in the Old Testament, they're sinful in the New Testament, because the idea of them, these sins, is intrinsically sinful. Murder is sinful, always sinful. From the very beginning, it's sinful, and throughout everything, murder is sinful. Theft is sinful. And then you have the other side, where there are things that only become sinful in the context of preserving the Israelite nation and keeping them in a way kind of physically superior to the other nations. You had dietary laws. You had eventually you couldn't marry your sister. You couldn't marry your close relative or whatever. There were a number of things. You couldn't work on Saturday, on the Sabbath day. All of these things weren't inherently sinful, but God instituted them as laws to preserve the Israelite nation for the purpose of fulfilling the promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and bring about Messiah into the world. Later on, we see in the New Testament that those things are, some of those things are rescinded. So the idea of worship, or not worshiping on the Sabbath, but just resting on the Sabbath, not working on the Sabbath, was not part of the New Testament. You have the idea of the sacrificing of animals goes away. Christ is the perfect sacrifice. You have the idea of unclean versus clean animals. The dietary laws goes away. A lot of the ritual cleaning or cleanliness type stuff goes away. Like we don't bar women who are on their period from participating in society and that kind of thing. So Stephen says, if we stop and think incest is not intrinsically repulsive, it is because for generations and generations across multiple cultures it has been customarily taboo. I'm not saying I approve of incest. I'm merely addressing why we are disgusted with it. Yeah, no, exactly so. I don't know that the Bible itself, or the New Testament, condemns incest, but I think the idea that it comes up in Leviticus has brought it to the forefront of our minds. Why would God forbid it under the Old Testament? That's led us to our understanding of the genetics and the genetic the crossbreeding and stuff. I'm sure through inbreeding through the inbreeding of animals and stuff, they began to see problems and whatnot, especially as the genetic code has degraded over time. You had a lot of royals, the Romans, the English. There was a lot of incest that went on. You had to be of royal blood. Well, what that meant is that had a very, very narrow genetic pool to draw from. And so you had a lot of people who were crazy. Look at Nero. Who's to say that his madness wasn't generations of inbreeding and whatnot. So while it's not necessarily condemned, it's definitely frowned upon culturally in at least the West, here in America, but not so much in other places. But it's not intrinsically sinful. And so we have to examine the Bible based on what the Bible says, not how we feel about a topic. And so incest is one of those, you feel like you got to tiptoe around it, but I'm not a tiptoeer. I'm too big for that. And so I'm just going to state it as it is. Incest is not inherently sinful, and it's not condemned as far as I know in the New Testament. I'm not advocating for it from a scientific perspective. I think it's a bad idea, especially generations of incest. Certainly, it's illegal here in the United States, at least for a little bit longer. Although part of this whole immorality thing is people are pushing all kinds of sexual envelopes, and so I'm sure part of that is going to be we see family members and stuff getting back together, but that's the least of my concerns in terms of all of that. Brian says, wouldn't it be mentioned that Cain married one mentioned already? Seems like there were others on the earth at the same time. Adam and Eve seem a separate experiment. So that's a very common understanding. It's a myth, and it has no support in Scripture. That's purely eisegetical, to insert other people and to assume, because of our own modern ideas about incest or whatever, that Cain would have had to marry from a different genetic pool. You cannot find that anywhere, and it actually contradicts the idea in Genesis 2 where Adam says that he called her name Eve because she was the mother of all the living. Eve can't be the mother of all the living, talking about all humans, if there were already others in the world. So I reject that idea out of hand. So I don't agree with that at all, Brian. All right, so anyway, back to the text. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Enoch, and he builded a city, and he called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. And unto Enoch was born Irad, and Irad begat Mehujael, and Mehujael begat Methusael, and Methusael begat Lamech. And Lamech took unto him 2 wives. The name of the one was Ada, and the name of the other was Zillah. And Ada bare Jabal, and he was the father of such that dwell in tents, and of such as have cattle. And then his brother's name was Jubal, so Jabal and Jubal. He was the father of all such as handle the harp and organ. So wow, a lot of people, when they look back at this time period, they're imagining, because Adam and Eve and fashioning animal skins and stuff, they're practically caveman in a lot of people's eyes. But these people lived 1,000-year lifespans. Could you imagine all of the things you could accomplish in 1,000 years? Now imagine that you're bigger, that you're stronger, that you're faster, and that you're way smarter than you are now, and you live for 1,000 years. Can you imagine how fast the technology of the day would pass? Here we are. We got Cain is 2nd generation, Enoch is 3rd, Mehujael is 4th, Methusael is 5th, Lamech is 6th, and then Jabal and Jubal are 7th generation after Adam. And they are inventing harps and organs and instruments. And then Zillah also bare Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. These guys are not primitive at all. These guys are building with metallurgy already. We're talking 7th generation from Adam, and these guys have already figured out how to work with brass and iron, which I imagine was lost for a little while after the flood, given that there were so few that survived, and we ended up having to go back through another Bronze Age and eventually the Iron Age with the Romans. And the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. And Lamech said unto his wives, Ada and Zillah, Hear my voice, ye wives of Lamech. Hearken unto my speech, for I have slain a man to my wounding, and a young man to my hurt. Want to go to the ESV here, just to get a different understanding of this than the archaic English. Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, Hear my voice, you wives of Lamech, listen to what I say. I've killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. So Lamech is saying that some young man hit him, maybe got into a fight. Lamech is kind of boasting here, is what I get out of this. And he says, if Cain's revenge is 7-fold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. So he's kind of calling on his forefather Cain I should be protected if Cain's going to murder. And I think the implication is here that Lamech murdered this young man. Because, maybe the guy brushed up against him. Maybe he, you imagine the scene you see in the movie all the time. Some wimpy little nerd walks into a biker bar and accidentally bumps into this 250-pound muscle-bound biker dude, and the guy turns around and stares at him, and the next thing you'd see is the little nerdy guys in the toilet getting a swirly. But here, I'm seeing Lamech is really hearkening back to Cain, saying, Cain murdered a guy and he got this protection from God for 7 years. Well, I'm going to get it for 77. He thought he was all of that. And what we see here is from Cain, a line of wicked people. Lamech is representative of this line of wicked people. The curse of Cain, just his life and the way that he taught his descendants is a focus on physical things. It is a focus on, I'm not saying the cattle and the instruments and the metallurgy are evil things, but they're physical things. And there isn't any talk in here of a relationship with Jehovah, who is still walking around among the humans. They talk about the presence of the Lord. He's still there. He's still interacting with them. And so you have this line of people, and that's going to be come into play when we get into Genesis 5 and especially Genesis 6, which I'll do here in a few nights. So verse 25, and Adam knew his wife again, and she bare a son and called his name Seth. We don't know that Seth was the third son. We do know that Seth is the son that is kind of the line of the faithful, if you will. And so we go from Seth to Noah and all of this other stuff. As Cain, the way that it sounds, Cain is out and about and the family is growing and there's all these sons and daughters. And then Seth comes along and it says, for God says, she has appointed me another seed instead of Abel, whom Cain slew. And so the hearkening back here of back to Abel is faithful. Abel is pleasing to God with the things that he does, and Seth is following after that. So Stephen says, we'd like to talk about how advanced our civilization is because of the inventions we've made. Sometimes we can be conceited about it. That is to say, well, I can't hit the C more. Come on, there it is. All right. That is to say, we think because something we make is new to us, that it's never been made before. There are actually things that have been found in ancient cultures that we found that show we are not the original inventors, such as lighters and batteries. Batteries I use all the time in my physics classes. Potentially flight was around before the flood. You have a number of things that potentially, I know that there's a hammer in Glen Rose, Texas, at the Creation Museum there that uses, I believe it's chlorine and iron, and the metallurgy of it isn't possible today. We don't have the technique to make a hammer out of such a combination of elements, so it's really weird to see a hammer made out of that kind of metal. And think of all the wisdom that has been lost over the years. Oh, absolutely. Definitely so much knowledge has been lost. We live such short lifespans, and we're not as focused. We're not, because of the fall and because of the flood and because of the degradation of our genetics, we're not as smart. We're going to see in Genesis 6 that there were giants in those days. We'll talk more about that in Genesis 6, but they were bigger, stronger, faster, smarter people than we are today. We are much, much lessened in terms of our physicalness compared to the people before the flood. So, absolutely. All right, so Seth is going to take Abel's place, that Abel who Cain slew. And to Seth, to him also there was born a son, and he called his name Enos. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. What does that mean? To call upon the name of Jehovah. Seth is the beginning of the line of the faithful, those who call upon the name of the Lord. We look at places like Colossians 3:17, whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord. This idea here is this faithful obedience. These are people who worship God in spirit and in truth, um, according to the will of God. Like Stephen said earlier, that they're right from the beginning. God establishes, or in this case, through Moses to the Israelites, he's showing, hey, there's a right way to worship God and there's a wrong way. You can do it God's way or you can do it your way, and your way is wrong. And we see in Matthew 15, verse 9, um, that there's vain worship. People who worship God according to their own traditions, their own devices. The denominations of the world have invented all of these things that God has not authorized them to do. The most obvious of these is like mechanical instruments, or we can talk about the organizational structures that we don't find in the Bible. These synods and these conventions and whatever, where they've got these centralized organizations. Well, God didn't set any of that up. And so man has added and added and added, and eventually they have, just like the Jews, superseded God's law with their own tradition. Another big one is what God teaches is necessary for salvation. God teaches some very specific things, including water immersion, are necessary for salvation. Most of the denominational world is, all I gotta do is believe. That's enough. And then some of them go so far as to say, you know what? God saves you first. He regenerates you first, saves you first, and then you believe. So you're saved even without faith, because it's all God's responsibility. And when we replace God's teaching, very clear teachings, very simple teachings, with our own traditions, our worship becomes vain, our service becomes vain. And if you look a little bit later there in Matthew 15, he says that every tree that my Father has not planted is going to be rooted up. And I put up an article here recently entitled "Denominations Are Weeds," because every denomination in the world is something that was planted by man. It wasn't planted by God. It's not the original church. Jesus only made one, and eventually you're going to see those all rooted up. How many denominations have been like they came into being and then there are no more? You can look that up. There's a list of over like 100 of them. We see now the Catholic Church is finally failing because of its absolute corruption. There are people who are Catholics. I was listening to a guy a couple of nights ago who doesn't even believe that the current guy claiming to be the Pope is the real Pope, and then the cardinals that voted him to be the Pope are corrupt. So, the whole organization is just falling apart because it's a man-made organization. It's a denomination. It's a division away from the original church, because it's teaching the doctrines of men. And so here, men begin to call upon the name of Jehovah. These are men who are followers. Abel was supposed to be that, but he was killed. And so he didn't have any children, didn't have any offspring. Seth here is like, I'm sure he heard all about Abel and his faithfulness. And so Seth is like, I want to be like my older brother Abel, who I never got to meet. And he teaches his children to be faithful followers. So Seth follows God. Enos follows God, because it's there that men begin to call upon the name of Jehovah. And we're going to see in Genesis 5 a contrast to Genesis 4, where we saw the line of Cain and we saw the line of wicked men. Now we're going to see the line of faithful men, and we're going to see people like Enoch, and we're going to see people like Noah, and these people that are taught generation after generation to follow after God. And Noah is kind of the end result. Noah and his family are the end result of that. So thank you for joining me tonight. I hope to see you as we continue on through this. I'm really having a good time doing this. I'm enjoying the interaction. And we will, my wife is going to Hawaii for a week. So I'll have a little bit different pattern, I think, getting the kids to sleep, or at least putting them onto something to keep them distracted. Maybe do these during the middle of the day and get some more interaction going because of that, at least for the next week. So we might even get through the flood by this next week. So again, thank you for joining me, and please leave comments. Even if you're watching this on the replay, leave comments. I will definitely come back and interact with you on that. Y'all have a good night.